Alright guys, welcome to week 9. We are again looking at bite-sized chunks of the Python programming language, and this week's little morsel is going to be on interaction. More specifically, we're going to be talking about input from the user. So let's take a look at this and jump into a very short lesson. So we're going to talk about two things specifically: this input function, and then additionally we're going to talk really quickly about escape strings. You might have seen them, but this might help illuminate some of that for you. Alright, so first, what is the input function? First, we know it's a function because we got these cool little parentheses here. We know it's not a method which belongs to an existing function because there's no period before it. And it's very purposeful that I put the input function further along in our studies than you'll find in most other Python tutorials. We'll get to that in a second, but now we're going to actually start to take input from the user, more specifically standard input, which is the keyboard. So let's really quickly talk about what the input function is. It's how we get data from the user by using the standard input, which is typically the keyboard. It can, but not necessarily, takes a string parameter. It can be assigned to a variable to store data, and also when we use the input function, the interpreter stops. It's at a full stop until it actually receives the expected input from the user or from standard input. Just a note, if you're using a REPL in Visual Studio Code, you might see some funky issues because a REPL does not dynamically assume values. It has to be hard-coded values, and we'll show you that in a second. So let's take a real quick look here. I've got my Python interpreter up. We're rocking and rolling. You can see we got our 3 chevrons, so we know we're actually in the interpreter. So let me put input in, just the function by itself, and I'll hit enter. And you'll see that my cursor is blinking, and where I typically would get more chevrons, I don't. It's actually waiting. The interpreter's at a full stop and it's waiting to proceed, and what it's waiting for is something from me. So let me just type in hello real quick and see what happens. I want you to note that the input function, as it takes the string text hello from standard input, all it does is immediately push that back out in the form of a string, as an output string. That's not very useful, but it is interesting because this kind of illuminates some of the input behavior. So let's quit out of this, and I want you to take a gander at what we've got going on here in Visual Studio Code. First, let's point this out. If you're using a REPL, like I suggest, you'll see that a REPL requires standard input to be hard-coded. In this code, I have the input function, which is asking for something. A REPL doesn't know how to handle that, so if you see that, I want you to be familiar with it. But let's take this step by step, line by line. First, we got our obligatory comment saying what we're trying to do here. We're looking at the input function with no parameters. Our first step is we're going to be printing a message. We're preparing to receive input. And then here we go. This is this funky escape character I was talking about. Anytime you see something in the string body of the print function and it's got a / and a character, that means that it's interpreting ASCII code. It's interpreting text strings differently than exactly what you see here. It's not going to print out a /. This actually is a shorthand mnemonic for new line or carriage return. So if you see a /n, what's going to happen? Expect that it's going to actually move the line down on your console. Additionally, there's /t, which is tab, that inputs 4 spaces without you manually having to go space, 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 space. And then I'll give you a whole table of other escape commands or escape characters. So just so you're familiar with that, a little something to add to your toolkit. So that's the first line. We're preparing to receive input, and then we see this is going to be interpreted as a new line down here in the terminal. Now, here we have a different execution of the input function. We're doing something funky here. We've got obviously a variable that we're trying to create because we have an assignment operator. This variable is called input var a, which I guess could be short for input variable a, equals to, and then it's equals to a function. Now if we go back, remember when I use the input function in just the standard command line interpreter, it gave me back a string right away. Whatever I took, it just immediately stringified it and gave it right back to me. This behavior is exactly what's going on, but instead of it coming back to the terminal where we see it, it's taking that output and it's dumping it right back into this variable. Remember, we go variable name, assignment operator, value. Well, instead of the value, we're getting a placeholder that says the user is going to give me values from the standard input. Now we know when we get to this input function, if it's on a statement, everything comes to a full stop. So the program will invariably wait forever until it receives something from us. Let's say we do input something, then it will continue on to the next line, but we'll also have whatever that input was in this variable. So the next line is print, you won't see me until, there's that escape sequence again, there's a new line, input is processed. So you can imagine this saying, you won't see me until, ellipses, and then the next line, input is processed. Then underneath at the very end we have a standard regular old print function. And what are we printing? We're printing the variable value. That variable value is now dynamic because it's going to be whatever we add to input. Let's take a look. Keep your eyes down here on the terminal. Here we go. Alright, so we've gone down all the way to line 3, print preparing to receive input. Now check this out. Preparing to receive input, and then we have our carriage return. There's a new line. That's what that escape sequence signifies. And then we got something funky here. We've got a cursor. It's a full block cursor. And that's kind of an indicator saying, hey, we're waiting for something. You got to give me something, user. So let's try and actually type, because typically when we're working in our programs, we can't actually type something in here. So I'm going to do my obligatory hello. Now let's take a look. We've entered input and we've done a carriage return, so it's gone on to the next line, saving that input into the variable. It's now printing, you won't see me until, new line, so next line down, input is processed, and then next line, print input variable. Well, now input variable has the value of hello. It's what I typed up here, and sure enough, boom, there it is. Alright, so you have just immersed yourself in the very introduction to input. I hope that helped. I hope that made sense. And the next time, in a couple seconds here, we're going to be looking at using a string parameter with input. So let's take a look here. We just looked at our brand new tool. It's a function. It has one parameter that can take, a string parameter, and it accepts primitive data types, right? It'll accept anything that we can type with standard input. So for those of us that want to follow along, this would be file input underscore a pi, and you do exactly what we just did. But that's not really helpful because it's a little confusing and ambiguous to have that block cursor, this thing right here, like doesn't tell us anything. So let's see how we can use that parameter and get a little more bang for our buck. All right. In this next file, we're going to be using the parameter for the input function and see how that changes. Let's take a look. All right, for the very astute of you, you'll note here we have almost the exact same code with one small change. Let's take a look at it line by line. We've got our comment. We're playing around with input function B. Let's see, we're printing, preparing to receive input, and there's our escape sequence. So we know we're going to print this text string out, then we're going to drop down a line. Now here we go. Here's our new variable, input variable B, and it's equal to input. But now input has a different form. Instead of it being these close parentheses like this, we're actually using a parameter. We're using a string parameter, and we're just literally typing out a sentence. Please enter some input. All right, sounds reasonable. We'll take a look how that affects us in just a moment. Then you'll see that saying, again, print, you won't see me until, let's throw a little ellipses in there, I like that. Our new line, which is our escape sequence, input is processed. Wow, we got spelling mistakes here. And then we're going to print out that variable again. Let's take a look how this new this new form of input works for us. All right, so immediately we see an instant change that kind of guides us into what we should be doing as a user. And let's be honest, this is the way we should be using the input function. We don't need this ambiguous, you don't know what you're doing as a user. You need all the prompts that you can possibly get. And that's what this is actually giving us here, is a prompt. So we've gone to preparing to receive input, that's line 3 right here. We've done our new line character, which is an escape sequence, that's right here. Then we're going down. We're going to add the value of this function into variable b. So we've constructed this variable in namespace. And now we're looking for input from a user, but we're using this parameter to give a prompt. And let's see it. Please enter some input. It's literally exactly what we wrote here in the prompt, in the parameter. And we have that block. So let's type in something. Hiya. And here we go. Exact same results. You won't see me until new line character right here. Input is processed. And then we're now printing out input variable b. So functionally speaking, this doesn't do anything that modifies or changes the value that we're saving into the variable, but it does give us a useful process in which we can kind of give information to the user. Now you could do this a long roundabout way. Let's go back over here. Let's clear this out. And you could say, instead of printing out, please enter something here with a print statement, but that's not very helpful. That's not elegant at all. It's much better to use the parameter to prompt the user. All right, so I hope that helped illuminate how we use the parameters in the input statement. Very simple. It just takes a string and then it then presents that string before requesting the input from the user and saving it to a variable. All right, challenge time. I want you to play around with input. I know you've been following along the last 2 examples, but this is going to be a little different. Here's what I want from you. I want you to create 2 variables. Let's call them num1 and num2. I want you to add input statements, or excuse me, input functions to those statements so that they're assigning values to those respective variables. And then underneath that, I want you to print the sum of num1 and num2. Now that could be literally as simple as typing the print function num1 plus, which is an addition operator, num2. I want you to give that a shot and then replay or resume this video. Alright, so what did you expect when you used the inputs, the 2 inputs, to add together your numbers? And then what did you get? And then how did those expectations and that execution differ? Let's take a look at it together, shall we? Alright, so let's take a look at what we're attempting right now. We are going to create 2 variables, num1 and num2. We're going to assign values from input to each number respectively, and then we're going to print the sum of num1 and num2. Alright, let's see how this looks in execution. So here we go. Num1 is equal to input. We're going to put a little parameter to let our user know they have to put in the first number. Num2 to input, enter the second number, and then here I'm just doing a little f string so you can say, hey, the user, you've entered number 1 and number 2, whatever those are, and then we're going to print the summation. Alright, let's give this a go. Alright, so far so good. It's asking to enter the first number. Let's do 7. Enter the second number, 11, and then let's take a look here. You've entered 7 and 11. That's all good. But when we try to summize num1 and num2, we actually get 7, 11. That's not the expected output. Now why is that, do you think? Well, if we go back, input can take a string parameter, but the input that it actually takes is also a string. the data that we're putting in from standard input is always going to be typecasted as a string. So what's actually happening is we are getting concatenation. It's treating 7 not like the number 7, but like a character 7, and it's treating 11 again like the characters 1 1, and then it's concatenating them, adding them together, putting them adjacent to each other. So that's not the expected output, but that's something that you should be aware of when you're messing around with input. It's going to stringify all of the standard input, because that's the expectation, and then it's going to store those as strings. I bet if we hover over here, is it going to give us one? There we go. You'll see that num1 is actually of type str, which means string. So let's take a sec, think on this, and figure out how we can actually get numbers. Alright, I hope you had a quick think and you're starting to look back in your previous toolbox to see what we can do. And again, this is a reason why I add input until later in the course, and I think you'll find in most other tutorials. Let's take a look at what we do know and what we've got. I'm gonna take this statement right here. I'm gonna comment this out. I'm gonna rewrite this to some degree. So we know we've got a variable here. We know we have an assignment operator. And then this, let's just, for clarification purposes, let's just move this down. We have an input. What we're doing is we're actually taking a string from standard input from the user, and we're going to store it into num1, the variable. But we also have something else that we can utilize. We can use typecasting. If you remember this is from a while back, but there's a function that's called int. And what function does is it takes a character, and if it's a numeric, a string, that's a number, it will attempt to convert it into an integer. But it's not as straightforward as just saying int. You know, we have to actually find a way to make sure whatever's going into it is the character, the string. And that string actually comes from input. So we've got some finagling to do here. One thing that we can do is, let's keep our parameter out, but we can encapsulate this entire input and pass it as a function to int. Essentially what that's doing is that's adding kind of layers onto this cake. What we're doing is we're saying num1 is equal to whatever it is, it's going to be an int, and that int is coming from, or being passed from, the input function. So you can see how we're kind of like putting it's like inception. We're going into a layer and into a layer. And this is kind of the creative thinking that you're going to have to be doing to solve these problems. So let's take a look at num now. And you'll see that the type is actually an int. Whereas if we look down at num2, before we've used the int function, it is a string. Interesting. Alright, so let's go put our parameter back in there. Now we're doing yet another layer. We're putting a parameter within the input, which is within the int, the typecasting function. And it looks really confusing on the face, but I want you to think about it logically. And that's typically why when I code, I'll do it one step at a time, right? Think about it, and in verbose, conversational, statements. I need to create a variable, and that variable needs to be equal to something. It needs to be taking a value from something I'm giving it, right? So we've got our first part of the statement. Num1 is equal to an input, but that input needs to prompt the user. So let's put that parameter in here. Oh wait, that's going to be a number. So I need to actually make sure that whatever's coming from this input is being somehow transformed, converted into a number. I've got a tool for that. It's the input function. But the input function needs to encase the actual, or excuse me, the int function needs to encase the input function. It's a little confusing, and if this is your first time seeing this, it's gonna take some time going over to get to wrap your brain around it. But I want you to think about it in terms like that, just small bite-sized chunks. And once you have all the tools on the board, all that's left is just to kind of rearrange them and place them in a way that gets you what you want. So let's get rid of that. I'm going to add the int function here. I like to give these guys some room to breathe, so I always add a little bit of a space in there. Alright, so we can read this logically from left to right. Let's see. We've got a variable that we're creating in namespace. We're going to call it num1. We're going to give it the value of, well, whatever that value is, it's got to be a number, because we're going to do some mathematical function with it. And that number is coming from, well, it's coming from the user, so it's input. But I want that user to know what they're doing, so I'm going to add a little prompt here. So if you kind of talk through the problem, right, this is where programming becomes more art than analytical function, and less mechanical, more artistic. I want you to think about it in terms like that. So let's clear this terminal, and let's give it a run and see what happens. Alright, first number, let's go 7 again. Expecting, or it's behaving as expected. Second number, 11. You have entered 7 and 11, and sure enough our output is 18. Fantastic, we did exactly what we came to do. Alright, so that concludes input as a function, as a tool for you, a developer, and I hope that kind of gives you some more insight, right? We can use input to gather a string, a series of characters from the user. We can use that as a variable. We can throw that into or assign it a variable name as the value itself. We can manipulate those values by turning them into ints. We can also prompt the user. There's a lot of flexibility that we can do with the input function, and you'll see that over the course of the next couple weeks. I hope that helped. Talk to you guys later. Have a good one.